For some reason, every time I sit down to watch a blaxploitation film for this channel, it turns out to not really be one. Well, Black Shampoo. That was definitely a blaxploitation film. But this movie, Across 110th Street, wasn't quite what I was expecting. Now, if you don't know what blaxploitation is, maybe check out my video about the spook who sat by the door. I talk about it extensively there, and that's also just a very interesting movie. I'm not going to spend this whole video trying to classify what kind of film this is, but it's a starting point. Across 110th Street came out in 1972, and it's set in Harlem and filmed there. Harlem is where you end up if you cross 110th Street, unless you're going south. This is more or less a procedural film. It starts out with a crime. Some men dressed up as cops rip off the mob, and we spend the rest of the movie seeing who will get to them first. Kind of an abrupt beginning, honestly. It throws you right into the mix of it. You kind of realize, oh, this is a crime that's being committed. Oh, these are the police. Oh, these are gangsters. You spend, like I said, most of the movie wondering who will get to these guys. Will it be the cops, or will it be the gangsters? On both sides, we have some uneasy racial alliances. That's putting it mildly. Anthony Quinn and Yaphet Kotto, these are the cops, who reluctantly join forces. One of them's a bit older, one of them's a bit younger. One of them is white, one of them is black. They're investigating for the NYPD. This isn't exactly Lethal Weapon. And really, their relationship is a bit vague. They kind of set up some more adversarial moments at times, but in other moments, they seem to work together a little bit more. So maybe not the highlight of the film, seeing their relationship, but there are some interesting dynamics. On the other side, there are Italian, I think, mobsters allied with some black gangsters. Both of these alliances are extremely tense. These are not people who are hanging out with each other after work. The gangsters in particular have a business relationship only that is peppered with slurs and mutual hatred. Anthony Quinn is the biggest name associated with this movie. He was one of the producers of the film as well, and he had a long list of people he wanted in the starring role. None of them took him up on the offer, so he cast himself. Anthony Quinn was an extremely interesting actor. I think he shines most when playing slightly unhinged and regressive characters, like Captain Metelli in this film, or like his most famous role, I guess, Zorba, the Greek. Again, Anthony Quinn, sort of a catch-all for playing non-American characters. In this film, Captain Metelli, extremely grumpy, but also a racist. And in some ways, that's a big thorn in your side as you watch the movie. But like I said, Anthony Quinn seems to shine in these somewhat regressive and unhinged roles, and I think he does it again. Here, if you're going into the movie hoping to root for him, well, you may be disappointed. Not exactly a villain, but I guess maybe an anti-hero of some sort. Anyway, Anthony Quinn himself was actually quite progressive, and in 1972, he would have been a staunch civil rights advocate. It's probably one of the reasons why he made this movie or was interested in helping to produce it. One of the things that's usually a bit sketchy about blaxploitation films is that while they star black characters and tell black stories, sort of hyper-stylized black stories, I guess, they're usually made by white producers and directors who get most of the gains, most of the profit, hence the exploitation angle. At least that's one of the exploitative angles. In some ways, this movie is really no different, although Anthony Quinn was Mexican-American, but I think the attitude of this movie might be less exploitative than some others, which isn't to say it's great, and that's really just my vague impression, so don't take it too much, but I think this is reflected possibly in the film itself. Contemporary reviews of this movie were actually quite negative. It seems like a lot of critics were jarred by how violent it is. Even by today's standards, this is a violent movie, and in 1972, it may have seemed completely gratuitous. Some critics also dismissed the dynamic between Kotto and Quinn as being derivative of other movies like In the Heat of the Night, which also talk about the new generation and the old. I think this is a telling comparison. Not a good comparison, a telling comparison. In truth, it's been a long time since I watched In the Heat of the Night, but as I recall, it's a pretty tame movie. I don't think it's a bad movie, but it's not exactly incendiary. It's a film that brings race into classic Hollywood, brings race into classic Hollywood, almost like another setting or character to color the old formula. It's almost like classic Hollywood is some sitcom they're doing, and one week there's going to be a character who is black or something like that. Apparently, Anthony Quinn actually wanted Sidney Poitier for this movie. but Harlem residents convinced him, supposedly, not to cast him. When it comes to Sidney Poitier, it's hard to avoid the R word, respectability. In the Heat of the Night is a respectable movie, and really it's no surprise that a critic who thinks of that as the appropriate and sophisticated way to put race into a movie would not be a fan of Across 110th Street, which is not tame at all, and which is not particularly respectable. So I'm not trying to throw in the Heat of the Night under the bus here, and I think there is some nuance, without a doubt. But like I said, telling comparison for people to say, oh, well, this isn't anything like In the Heat of the Night, yeah, maybe you missed the point of the movie, if that's your conclusion. I'm making this sound a bit like an unhinged movie, but really, it isn't exactly. It is a movie that departs from classic Hollywood fairly significantly, and it does borrow a couple of things from blaxploitation, but I don't think it gets into the extremes of that genre. So let me give you some more. Let me give you some actual examples here. First, let's talk about how it leaves Hollywood behind. Probably the most striking thing about this entire movie is how it's filmed on location. This was apparently the first film made with the Reflex 35BL, which is a particularly light, well-balanced, and quiet camera, which opened up filming and also recording sound in all kinds of small, interesting locations. Otherwise, lots of scenes that would have had to be shot on sets. One of the producers of this film was a pioneer of location filming who'd been involved with the television show I Spy, which is actually kind of an interesting comparison if we're talking about, groundbreaking race films and television shows. I Spy is a very, very interesting thing, but story for another time. Anyway, these advances really show in the film. We get a lot of extremely authentic locations, and we get all kinds of shots that you just wouldn't really see otherwise. Like, there's a lot of handheld filming in this movie. There's even a scene where they've got a camera up on the top of a building, and it swings around in circles as if it's hanging from the side of a building. Not to spoil anything. That would have been very difficult to make with some of the larger, bulkier cameras. And it's almost as if that shot makes it into the movies because somebody thought, hey, look what we can do with this thing, So you can absolutely see the influence of the technology in this film. The handheld footage is cool. I think it's not just, hey, we've got new stuff. I think it really serves the film well. And it is pretty jarring at times. At moments, it almost seems weird to see Anthony Quinn filmed like this. There were a few scenes where I wondered, wait a minute, what's this Hollywood star doing walking down the street? There's this kind of energy and authenticity to this movie that's really cool. And that just completely separates it from a more classic film. The movie also makes for a cool historical document, I think. This is not a tourist film. You don't get a bunch of skylines, although there is some aerial photography in the beginning. In some ways, the geography of Harlem really isn't coherent at all in the film. You don't get an introduction to it saying, and here we are, crossing 110th Street. Well, I guess you do cross 110th Street at the very beginning, but there's not a lot of grounding landmarks in the film, I would say. It's more just on the city blocks and such. Nonetheless, you get some great shots of the real New York City in the 1970s, and I gotta admit, I paused this movie several times to look around, see which street we were on, see what buildings there were. I used to live in Harlem, by the way, for 2 years. That's a story for another time, but my Top 250 video was filmed in my apartment on 125th. Anyway, this movie feels absolutely nothing like In the Heat of the Night in many ways, and locations are another perfect example of this. Of course, that movie is set in the South, so it's kind of a different story, in Sparta, Mississippi, although it was actually filmed in Sparta, Illinois, which again is telling. There's no faking Harlem, right? There's no way this movie could have been filmed anywhere else. Although, to be fair, the chase scene at the end does appear to have been filmed much farther south than Manhattan, that is. Anyway, a movie that, like I said, probably the most striking thing about it is the use of locations. And I guess maybe some of the handheld photography. There's a nice little moment towards the beginning of the movie that underscores, I think, some other departures that this movie makes from classic Hollywood. Starts out when Captain Metelli is talking about crime, talking about the crime in the station, and he sort of pauses mid-sentence and he's thinking, and then we get a cut to him riding in a cop car where he finishes his thought. He says, I can handle it. I think he says, I hope I can handle it, or something like that. And the guy sitting next to him in the cop car says, what? What are you talking about? I really like this moment because it's playing off this classic trope where conversations are stitched together across locations and time, right? The idea that someone starts talking and then you cut somewhere else and they're still having the same conversation. They're still mid-sentence as if no time has passed. This is almost parodying the idea of invisible classic style, or at least one trope of it. This is a little thing, but I think it's emblematic of a lot of choices here. Rather than something classic, we have something a lot more raw. Now, on the other hand, this is a pretty stylish movie. A lot of blaxploitation films have radical style. In fact, it might be the most consistently unorthodox genre in terms of style, I would say. This movie doesn't go overboard, but it has some of the stylings here. For instance, it has a funky soundtrack. There are some raw scenes that happen in silence, and also some scenes that seem almost choreographed to the music. The music in this movie is great. I mean, look, it came out in 1972, great score or soundtrack. A lot of it's done by Bobby Womack, and the title track, Across 110th Street, I think ended up being a pretty big song for him, and that is a great song in and of itself. So if you're not going to watch the movie, just at least go and listen to the song Across 110th Street. At least do that. There, like I said, is some stylistic variances here. There are some scenes, like I mentioned, that are just shot outside on the street, handheld. Doesn't seem like they did any special lighting. Doesn't seem like they even really got extras. They just kind of took the camera out in Harlem. Pretty cool. No real stylistic embellishment, it would seem, unless you count some of the elements of the handheld footage itself. There are also some scenes inside a club where we've got really moody lighting, and it does look a little bit more choreographed and a little more staged. There's one really interesting cut in this movie. If you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's towards the end of the film. There's a match cut of a man screaming that's really cool, and that alludes more towards sort of the blaxploitation style, I would say. So there are moments of it, without a doubt, but I think the movie does a good job of kind of balancing these things, giving us some stylish things, giving us some interludes where the movie really clicks along, but also slowing down at times and taking a much more raw approach and giving us something maybe a little bit deeper. It turns out that there are three people who are involved with the crime that begins the film. One of them takes the money and spends it extravagantly, and this is how we end up in the club. And then there are some scenes, there's some scenes with this guy and a bunch of prostitutes and whoever else he bumps into that I think would be at home in a blaxploitation film. The other two people in the movie are really different, and the scenes with them are really different. One of them, who kind of, I guess, ends up being the emotional linchpin of the film, gives us a good look at some of the systemic factors that lead to crime. This part is way more raw. So, like I said, there's a balance. Style is only part of the story here, too. Though another thing that's really crucial is the lack of moralism in the movie, which is, again, the opposite of something like In the Heat of the Night or classic cinema in general. It's hard to draw any particular conclusions from this film. In some ways, this lack of moralism is a hallmark of blaxploitation as well, but I think a lot of those films almost take that as far as it possibly can go, making it so, having so much kind of sordid and over-the-top stuff go on that it's impossible to corral the movie into any moral framework whatsoever, or that the movie, those movies they lack moralism so much that they usually end up being quite regressive and weird, This movie doesn't go that far, but it leans away from Hollywood moralism, and that's another place where I think they get the balance right, and it's just kind of some things happening. I mentioned some reviews that say that this movie is about the new generation of police versus the old. That barely even registered for me while I was watching the movie, but it's interesting that a reviewer would look for, again, some sort of moralistic structure in the film. To me, that seemed like such a minor point, something that you kind of notice in the background, but that is not the purpose of the film at all. A minor point compared to all the trauma and the conflict that the movie shows us. That's what's center stage here, I think. Like I said, we get some idea about systemic factors, but it's not a moralistic justification. Really, this is a film that paints a picture of many different unacceptable lifestyles, many different conflicts that are raging on, whether or not that's racism in the police, racism in the mob, the conditions, or just people having to choose between poverty and crime, right? Unflinching might be the best word to describe this movie. Of course, What is the line between unflinching and over the top? Hard to know. And it's possible that this movie takes things farther than it should. A little hard to know. There are some things that I wish this movie did differently. For instance, I wish that it showed us some of the beauty in Harlem. Like I said, I lived there for 2 years, and I was constantly struck by how beautiful it was. Now, I know in the 70s things were different, but I think that it still was a beautiful place in some ways. And maybe it's trite to say this, but I think it's fair. I think it's a fair criticism of this film to say that it is one-dimensional, or could have more dimensions to it, at least. In some ways, it's kind of a small movie. Like I said, in some ways, it's a procedural that follows a crime from start to as close as you can get to a finish under these circumstances. And maybe for some people, they might want it to declare something more, to take more of a stand on things, which it doesn't really do. Like I said, mostly just kind of an unflinching movie. I want to mention a few last things. I like the use of stairwells in the film. The stairwell really is the icon of the Harlem apartment in this movie. There are a couple of really cool shots looking up the stairwell and seeing the residents looking down. This is an interesting contrast to the elevator shaft in the building at the end of the film. Towards the end of the film, we are taken to a building that is under construction. I guess, yeah, not quite the end, but towards the end. And again, this is a bit of a contrast to the buildings in Harlem. I like the parallel investigations that happen in this movie. This is a somewhat common idea. Here, the cops really get schooled by the gangsters, though. There's a great scene of the police looking through their records. They have this huge basement full of filing cabinets. And they pull one of the files out. They think they might be onto something. They're reading through this guy's history, and then they realize that he's dead. This big paper archive stands in for a particular type of organization and a particular conception of information as well, from before an age of digital indexing and search. I think that's really cool to see kind of how hopeless some of the police's methods are in some ways. The mob is, in some ways, much more sophisticated. They apparently have ears inside almost every taxi cab. It's funny that that's kind of maybe a reversal of the capabilities today, where the NYPD has license plate scanners at every entrance and exit to Manhattan and across 59th Street, I think. So that's across 110th Street. Like I said, it's a cool movie. Maybe slightly one-dimensional, but I think it's an interesting balance between blaxploitation and social realism, I guess you would say, that I think actually comes off a lot better than a lot of movies that are firmly in either one of these categories. If you are looking for a classic Hollywood take on race, a morality play about race, this is not the movie. And I think that's why some people didn't really understand what the heck it was when it came out. Also, if you're looking for a blaxploitation film that's totally unhinged and wild, then this might feel kind of tame and pointless to you. But like I said, for me, this movie actually strikes a balance that is maybe more valuable than a lot of the things that fall squarely into those genres. So that's across 110th Street.